Okay, what's up? What do you want to talk about?
Okay, Patrick, you're gonna have to remain sane for the next 15 minutes, or at least make the attempt to remain sane for the next 15 minutes. I wanted to talk about those three words that you like, the law of alteration. Would you give me a second chance to explain that in much more succinct terms this time?
Yes.
Sure. So, in our last video on correlative ethics, I laid out the two different theories that exist within that system. And the first theory, as you and I are aware, is called the law of permanence, excuse me, that says that maxims are universalizable. They have and certain maxims like aggression can be used at any time, any place, anywhere. That doesn't imply that they actually get enacted by every single moral agent. Is that moral agents possess the potential to act out those maxims. I use the word maxims to either refer to rules of conduct and intentions, but since I think that rules of conduct can only be derived by intention, then I use both of those interchangeably, those two concepts. And then there is the law of alteration that says that consequences alternate based on.
Okay, stop.
This.
The summary of the first thing, I forgot what you named it, was that people can be bad, right?
They have the potential to be bad.
Yeah, that's what I said. People can be bad. We got that.
Right.
All right. I would call that the people can be bad rule. Let's move on. What's the next one?
Okay. The law of alteration, that consequences alternate based on the singularity or plurality of moral agents that are enacting a certain, axiom. Like, I use the classroom example. If a teacher is really adamant based on her rules of conduct.
Stop.
Okay.
So far it seems like you've said that consequences change based on the number of people taking the action. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Continue.
All right. And I use the classroom example in which each student is accepting the risk of the possible consequences. So in a test, right? And let's assume that the teacher is very adamant against the use of cheating on a test. She is very anti-cheating. She is all for student integrity, right? And each student is consciously weighing in the option of either cheating on a test or staying honest. Now, if everyone chose to be honest, there's the consequences of them passing or not is going to depend on the person, right? It is subjective in that sense. But let's assume now that the teacher is not adamant about students cheating on a test, right? She doesn't really care. So she's implying some consent to cheating, right? Not everyone is going to cheat correctly, right? There's going to be some people who cheat poorly and do a really bad job, even though I find that hilarious. And there's going to be people that do extremely well. What I'm trying to argue is that the law of alteration says that people change their moral intentions based on the consequences that they predict will await them, is what I'm trying to get at. And assuming that there was a third party, right? I would call that third party a teacher, but I don't know that third party is a correct term, that arbitrates a rule of conduct or a syllabus, right, that the moral
Okay,
agents
so I
within
think you're
class
saying
agree to.
that people respond to incentives.
Yes.
Okay. Usually they do, yes.
Right.
Not always,
I
but
want
okay.
right, not always. I'm not implying
So what?
that.
Therefore what?
So therefore, to use a different argument, that if performatively, it would be a mere impossibility for every single person to consent to the axiom of violence.
It would be impossible for everyone to consent to violence.
Right. Because the whole
Do you mean the
if I
initiation
hold
of violence?
if I hold the intention to initiate violence on another person, and that person agrees, or implicitly or explicitly says, "Okay, I would like for you to violate my rights," which seems silly, but let's just use that assertion.
Yeah, that's a performative
Then,
contradiction. If you consent to your right being violated, it's not being violated because you consent to it. This
but I would
goes back to our previous conversation about boxers and getting beaten with sticks
right,
on private property. Yeah.
right, but I would, but you would argue that in the case that both people consent to it, it loses the other concept of violence, correct?
It depends on what your definition of violence that you're using is. When I use violence, I just mean
Physical confrontation.
yeah.
You're
It could be
saying.
moral or immoral violence. Yeah.
So when is violence moral? I was going to ask you that
Defensive.
follow-up question.
Defensive
For
violence.
incentives?
Defensive.
Oh, defensive violence. Okay.
Uh huh.
Means of retaliation. So let's say a two people consent to shoot and kill each other, right? Which is what gangs in South Los Angeles do. The Blood and the Crips. They all have treaties in which they negotiate when we're going to shoot each other, and no one knows when they're actually going to get shot, right? But they just have these weird mafias that organize violence onto one another, right? I would argue in the case in which they are consenting to use violence, just the fact that they are utilizing violence, it denies the antecedent, which is consent, right? Because consent would imply autonomy. Once violence is employed to any form of human interaction, there is a loss of consent, hence autonomy. Would you agree with that?
If the violence is consensual, then it is not immoral.
Why would you say that? I'm just curious. I just want to, because I would argue that the consent to violence are two bundled concepts into one another. It's like saying I agree voluntarily to impair the autonomy of another person, physical or mental, whatever form of autonomy you want to choose.
Uh huh. And if you don't have the ability to consent to such an impairment of your autonomy, then you didn't have autonomy.
But let's assume that the person who is initiating force is using their autonomy to limit someone else's autonomy, which is what the initiation of force is. I choose to punch you in the face. I choose to limit your physical autonomy. Do you agree with that? It just seems like two bundled concepts into one.
Boxers aren't limiting each other's autonomy when they step into the ring for a boxing match.
Well, I mean, if I technically knock you out, if I commit a TKO against you, and if I punch you in the jaw, you're going to go night night. Isn't that limiting your physical autonomy in that sense?
That would be that boxer limiting their own autonomy by consenting to that. In the same way that if they knocked themselves out, it was a consensual act of violence that resulted in a loss of autonomy. They chose it.
They chose it, but they chose it under a priori conditions, because there are rules in boxing, in which case, okay,
sure, yeah.
I can punch you in the jaw, but I can't bite you in the ear like Mike Tyson did. There's an extension into which violence becomes unnecessary based on the a priori conditions in which people consented to that form of violence in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, if I consent to be beat with a stick and you beat me with a car tire, then you have violated my consent, and that's an immoral act of violence. However, if you beat me with a stick like I consented to, that is still an act of violence, but it's a consensual one, not immoral.
And let's assume that there's an assailant that is viewing this violence. Do I have, or to put a better example, I'm a vigilante, and I am here to monitor the violence that happens within a community without, obviously, the dependence of a police force, right? Is it okay for me to use violence in whichever way I want to, exercising my autonomy that might limit the physical capacity of others to act, right? Vigilante justice is what. How would that conception work in relating to the consensual acts of violence?
So it would probably work. You look at it from the other direction. So if there's a criminal that has violated someone's consent or property, and someone comes along, I guess you could call them a vigilante if you wanted, but because all humans are equal, it wouldn't matter if they were an official vigilante or a random person vigilante.
Right.
If they were to go after and grab or attack this criminal, what would the criminal's defense be? Sorry, you can't violate my rights after I just finished violating someone else's. Sorry, you can't control my property after I just finished damaging someone else's. Well, that's a performative contradiction.
So in that sense, if it's a performative contradiction, you would define that as immoral, correct?
No, I don't see.
Okay.
So the criminal has no defense, logically or morally.
Right.
So it doesn't matter who is doing the going after the bad guy, official or vigilante or whatever. All humans are equal.
Right.
Now, if this vigilante person, whatever, official or otherwise, went after an innocent person, then they would be the initiator of force, deserving of defensive violence.
So there's some interesting variables there in the equation. So a vigilante cannot say, I am going to protect my own interests against those who initiate force. But let's say that prior to me wishing to protect my own interests, I initiated force onto others. Since that is a contradiction in terms, wouldn't we imply that just because that person didn't take any logical induction into account that their acts would be considered immoral? Because I cannot say, in order to do good, I must initiate force onto others, in which case others can initiate force onto me. I mean, that seems like a mouthful there, but so I'm trying to get it to the point where you said that that criminal cannot protect him or herself. And let's assume that vigilante uses whatever means in order to commit violence onto that person that doesn't have any form to protect him or herself with. Well, obviously, in a logical world, we know who would win that fight. The person who has the biggest guns, the person who has the biggest artillery, the person who has the most power, the vigilante, power in terms of the physical, against the person who has no means to self-defense, right? So how would that dichotomy between the most powerful person in this situation between two people is initiating force and the least powerful person who is attempting to retaliate but has no realistic means of doing so?
Like now, when the cops murder people, like just happened recently.
Right. But
it doesn't change
you
the
have to,
ethics of the situation. It just means that bad guys win sometimes. Yeah, that sucks.
well, yeah, right. The bad guys win sometimes, but we have to be clear on what bad is. If a vigilante's purpose is,
Intent doesn't matter for ethics.
well, I would argue that actions have to derive from intent, right? If I'm an aggressor, I have the intent to limit the autonomy of another person, and my victim, right? If I point a
Doesn't matter
gun
what
to
you
the back
intend
of
to
my
do. It matters what
victim's
you
head,
actually do.
well, but those actions aren't random, right? I would argue that they have to be caused by some a priori events. They don't just actions don't just come into existence. I was about to say that if I point a gun to the back of my victim's head and tell him 2 + 2 does not equal 4, it equals 5. Well, we all know that force is going to nullify the human skull. It's going to nullify human reason. Force is the antagonist to human reason. And in which case, the person who is being victimized by the aggressor is going to intent, right, to act on the intentions of the other person who's committing that aggression itself. I'm going to have to obey the whim of the person who is coercing me to do things that I don't want to do. So actions need to be arrived by intent, right? Because
But the act that
human
was
beings,
immoral was not the malintent of the guy with the gun. It was the guy with the gun using the gun in a
so you're
criminal
saying
way.
that moral judgments cannot arrive at intent itself. It's what the intent leads to is what you're arguing for as immoral, correct?
Well, I don't know what you just said, but what I would say is that if we are trying to arrive at an objective moral equation, then the only things that we can plug into that equation and have it still be objective are objective things. And the only thing that is
Correct.
objective is actions that happen in the real world, not the hidden smoky intent that is bouncing around between neurons in people's heads.
Right, but
like there is no intent that could make murdering an innocent peaceful person moral.
But you would argue that people with bad intentions do consequentially arrive at good solutions, right? People with the worst intentions could do the greatest of things, but it doesn't take away the malice that
I think you
they
meant to say
carry
that the other way
in their
around,
mind.
right?
Or maybe people with good intentions do bad things as well. I mean, the
That's the
converse
saying.
is true.
Yeah, the saying is
Right.
people with the best of intentions end up doing great evil.
Right. So,
Like every cop.
right, but there, in case you take those conversing concepts and you say, well, people with good humane intentions do a lot of harm, but people who have harmful, negligible intentions may do well. Well, obviously we know that the consequences are probabilistic, right? They you can't act based on actions alone, because actions come from an antecedent. They have to come from someone's autonomy, from someone's free will, from someone conceptualizing how they're going to perform and act in the real world, is what I'm trying to argue.
Yeah, it just doesn't matter for morality, for ethics.
So morality for you, and I would assume that deontologists, I don't want to generalize or anything, but at least for you, morality is based off of action, right? Because it's calculable in the real world. Well, some actions are. I would argue, like I said, aggression is one of those tangible actions that could be calculated by an arbitrator in the real world. So that would be your definition of objective.
Well, for ethics to be objective, it has to involve objective things. Right. So you can't base an objective system on something subjective and call it objective. That would be a contradiction.
Well, I'm not saying that the intentions itself that are a precursor to an action are objective. It's what intentions are is your desire to act. It's your preference to perform a certain moral axiom in some way, right?
Now, there's nothing wrong with intention being looked at by some justice system when it comes to restitution determination. So, like, if it was accidental crime versus intentional crime, the restitution appropriate might be different. Maybe depends on the myriad of circumstances involved. But ethics doesn't really function. Doesn't really. It is. I mean, yeah, but for the determination of the objective judgment of the action, we have to only look at objective things.
Right, but just take it. You mentioned the word thing. Take a thing, a moral action, for example, such as manslaughter. There's, in both cases, there might be the purposeful manslaughter and accidental manslaughter. Let's say that consequentially, both people that performed that manslaughter, they did it by different means, but they killed the same amount of people, right? Should we just arbitrate and punish them based on their kill count, or the actual means in which both of these moral agents carried out those actions, right? One did it through accidents, right?
I've just been saying restitution is different from morality, the right and wrong of it. That's a separate discussion entirely. Yeah.
Well, I would argue that restitution does, because, for example, I'll take you an example, right? Every time I receive a tax refund from the IRS, I am receiving a form of restitution, because that money was taken from me without my consent.
No, let me put it another way. Let me put it another way. Right. So, if I accidentally kill somebody,
okay,
the debt I owe morally would be the same as somebody that purposefully murdered somebody without consent. Now, a justice system that we might choose to live in may subjectively assign different levels of restitution based on the intent of the crime. But morally, the victim's family, let's say, would be due the same restitution because the same act took place.
So you're implying a restitution in terms of equity, right? And in terms of the how do I put it?
I don't know why you got to use bigger words for what I just said pretty simply. Yes, like I just said it simply. Why do you want to say it complicated? Yeah, so Like if I steal your bike on purpose and I steal your bike on accident, then a court in a civilized society might assign restitution differently for those two cases. But bare minimum, morally speaking, absent preconceived contracts around justice and dispute resolution, the restitution would be the same. The owner of the bike could come and use force if necessary to retrieve his stolen property.
So as long as the intention of the person that is victimized is trying to retain a certain property that was enforced by another moral agent in the first place, that would count as
You're doing it again.
restitution.
I'm just saying, like, the moral equation doesn't change based on intent. But commonly, for the purposes of restitution, it's common in common law to have different levels of punishment and or restitution based on intent. But that isn't linked to an objective system of morality, I guess is what I'm saying. That's just common law practice or whatever, you know?
I would argue the forms of which restitutions are arbitrated is legal procedures, and the legal cannot be conflated with the moral.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And, you know, we'd probably appreciate it to be that way. Like, the whole thing, the whole island versus the city thing is just showing that humans don't like to live by raw ethics. They like to round off and soften the edges just to make life more peaceful and generally less severe. And that's fine. Like, it's fine. If somebody steals your bike, you know, you don't necessarily have to go and, you know, track them down, hold them at gunpoint, take your bike and their bike too, just because that's morally what you could be able to objectively do. But you know, you might call your dispute resolution company and take the insurance check for $150 and go get another bike. Like, you know, like in civilized society, you know, it's normal for people to want to soften the edges of ethics, and that's fine. We need that. That's good.
But I'm really not convinced that restitution would work if everyone held the eye for an eye principle, like you just described. That every single time that someone initiates force onto me, right, I can retaliate, or I can track the person who stole my bike down, but that would be completely useless if life was lived like that, like a tit for tat kind of equation between.
Well, my equation was actually 2 eyes for an eye. That was my equation.
Right.
Just to be clear,
argue that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
Well, maybe so. Maybe that's why we like to soften up on some of the edges.
Right.